Greetings everyone, Ben here from TheVirtualEconomist, and welcome to part 6 in my unusual trading guide. Yeah, you know, the episode that I've been promising for an entire year. Actually, that's no joke. I literally first hinted at this episode back in February of 2016. Anyway, it looks like I'll finally be able to continue on with the series, with this episode taking a look at 3 special types of unusuals: taunts, weapons, and unpriced items. Alright, so without further ado, let's get right on into it. First things first, let's talk about unusual taunts, the topic that everyone, and I mean absolutely everyone, seems to be asking me about. Now, on the surface, there really isn't anything special you need to know to understand unusual taunts. Just like hats, they are regular items with different unusual effects, and are priced with a price suggestion on backpack.tf. However, unlike most hats, unusual taunts have had a history of immense highs and now immense lows. You see, taunts were first released in the Love and War update in 2014, and were incredibly popular. They were also quite rare, and they could only be unboxed out of 2 specific crates, and this combined with their popularity led them to become very expensive and pretty difficult to obtain. At that time, they were almost like hybrids between Australiums and Unusuals, since really the only way to get one of them was to either buy it with pure keys or insane unusual overpay. All that changed with the groundbreaking Halloween 2016 update. In this update, Valve added unusualifiers to the creepy crawly case, which were essentially high-end tools that allow you to turn the taunt specified in the unusualifier into an unusual taunt with a random unusual effect. They even allowed you to turn taunts like the Bucking Bronco into unusuals, taunts that had previously no unusual variants, which was pretty sweet. However, the 2 other things that Valve did during the update were a lot less cool and completely changed the unusual taunt market forever. That is, they, number 1, doubled the unusual unbox rate. Essentially, during the event, this meant that the new unusualifiers were unboxed to oblivion, and an absolute crap ton of unusual taunts with new Halloween effects started to flood the market. And number 2, they allowed unusualifiers to grant old non-Halloween effects after the Halloween event ended, allowing new taunts to flood the market even on old rarer effects. All of this put together, unusual taunts are now very, very common. And unfortunately, when any type of unusual gets this abundant, they will inherently become hard to sell. Anymore, there are simply too many sellers compared to the amount of people that actually want to buy unusual taunts, causing too many people to try and enter undercutting wars to try and sell theirs first. In addition, many unusual taunts have prices that are very, very outdated. Since most taunts were priced on backpack.tf when they are rare and expensive, when people now get an old unusual off an unusualifier, they are handed an item with a backpack.tf price that reflects a time when taunts were nowhere near as common as they are now. Thus, these prices are way too expensive, and these taunts are basically impossible to sell at these high backpack.tf prices. While price adjusters are desperately trying to reprice and update taunts as fast as they can, there's still a lot of taunts that remain with prices that are either unupdated or still far too high. Because of all of this, unusual taunts have unfortunately attracted a very negative stigma and are generally quite hard to sell. Hopefully though, if you're watching this video in even 6 months or a year, a greater percentage of unusual taunts should be repriced and will reflect a more accurate value, making them theoretically a little bit easier to sell. But for now, I think it is appropriate to get into the unusual taunt effects, so you can see how well taunts actually sell at the time of uploading this video. Just like I did in my episode on unusual effects, I'm going to display each effect with a number, 1 through 5, down below. This number basically just represents how easy the effect is to sell, with a 1 being the hardest to sell and a 5 being the easiest. The original generation of taunts debuted in the Love and War update and had 9 effects. They are as follows: 72, Fountain of Delight, Holy Grail, Mega Strike, Midnight Whirlwind, Silver Cyclone, Screaming Tiger, Showstopper, and Skill-Gotten Gains. Now, just looking at these, it should be quite obvious that taunts really don't sell that great. Honestly, I may be undervaluing some of these, but considering so many of the original gen effects are stupidly overpriced on backpack.tf, I really do think that this is a fair average. Up next, the Halloween 2014 update brought 2 new effects. Honestly, there isn't really much point in me going over these, simply because they are the rarest effects in the entire game. There are 50 or less of each in existence, and chances are you will never get one. However, because of their insane rarity, these are the only effects that were not slaughtered by the Halloween 2016 massacre, and still sell pretty well. The effects are as follows: Ghastly Ghosts and Haunted Phantasm. Finally, this brings me to the Halloween 2016 effects. They are Spectral Swirl, Hellish Inferno, Infernal Flames, and Infernal Smoke. The sad thing is, these Halloween 2016 effects are visually some of the coolest unusuals in the entire game. However, they still all do sell quite poorly due to the massive supply and the taunt stigma. Fortunately, a lot of the prices on the Halloween 2016 effects are a lot lower and more accurate than on the original generation, and you can actually get some pretty sweet value out of these effects, being able to buy certain all-class taunts for as cheap as 40 keys. So, in conclusion, taunts are unfortunately hard to sell. There are simply way too many of them out there, and while taunts still look pretty insane, outdated prices and huge amounts of sellers doesn't really help one bit. In most cases, I would value unusual hats higher than unusual taunts, as most hats don't have obvious stigma against them. However, this doesn't mean that you should never trade for unusual taunts. Since they are harder sales, people are often willing to give you some insane deals on them. In the past, I've been able to buy quick sale taunts for over 40% off, and people are commonly willing to overpay 10, 20, or even 30 keys with them. However, I would recommend reselling these as quick as you can, since if the taunt is overpriced, you never really know when a price suggestion is imminent. Anyway, up next is unusual weapons. To be honest, unusual weapons are kinda strange, simply because they behave so differently than other types of unusuals. Unlike hats and taunts, there are an insane amount of different versions of each unusual weapon that can be unboxed. This is because, in addition to having effects, unusual weapons are always tiered, can be unboxed as strange unusuals, and are available only on weapon skins that have 5 distinct wears: battle scarred, well worn, field tested, minimal wear, and factory new. In addition, no skin pattern is exactly the same as any other, and the unusual effect wraps differently on each type of gun. All of this put together, there are a lot more variables you need to consider than with hats and taunts. You need to consider number 1, the skin itself, including what weapon it is for. Just like all other unusuals, soldier and scout skins sell the best, where heavy skins sell much worse. Number 2, the skin wear, with battle scarred being the worst and factory new being the best. Number 3, the tier, with mercenary being the cheapest and most common, to elite being by far the rarest and most expensive. Number 4, whether the weapon is strange or not. Obviously, strange is great for sellability. And finally, number 5, the unusual effect. In fact, let's go over the unusual weapon effects right now. At the time of making this video, there are only 4 unusual weapon effects, which appear in all skin cases, starting with the gunmetal update in 2015. The unusual weapon effects are as follows: hot, cool, isotope, and energy orb. Now, I'm just going to be blunt with you guys. As you guys should be able to tell from the effect ratings, unusual weapons really just don't sell that well at all. To me, the reason is twofold. Number 1, with a chance to get a scratched up wear, unusual weapons simply don't look as appealing as hats or taunts. In addition, the unusual effect shows up differently on each type of gun, and really is not always the most visible. There are also a lot of variables you have to consider when you see a new unusual weapon, and for a lot of people, I think that considering wear, tier, and everything like that is just pretty confusing. Number 2, the infrastructure on backpack.tf is quite lacking, and it is very hard to research the prices of unusual weapons. For instance, if you want to find the price of an unusual hat or taunt, just find the item on the unusual price list, where you can easily find past suggestions, sellers, and more. However, on unusual weapons, there is really no easy way to do this. You can find the effects on the effect price list, but the resulting list of skins is buggy and confuses skins and wares of a gun in a haphazardly and disorderly manner. In fact, because backpack.tf is so horribly set up for weapons, chances are you have literally no clue how to actually price check an unusual weapon. Thus, I figure it is appropriate to go over it in this video. The first thing you need to do is go to the effect price list and find the effect on your weapon, as you cannot just find weapons by searching by item. You will then be brought up to a page that is supposed to show each skin available with that effect. However, the amount in existence tracker is completely inaccurate, and there are no icons for skins, so you'll basically have to mouse over each one to find the correct skin. Turns out, it doesn't even matter what skin you select, since whatever skin you select for a specific gun will take you to the exact same stupidly glitchy page when you go ahead and click stats on the item. This is because the website confuses the stats for all skins and all wears of the weapon with that effect. Thus, all information on this page is mashed up together in an unorganized manner, including suggestions and sellers for weapons that you're not even looking up. Fortunately, after a little bit of searching, you should be able to find the suggestion and price you are looking for. If it isn't there, it means that it should be unpriced. If this sounds confusing, it certainly is, and honestly, there is literally no way that an inexperienced unboxer would be able to do what I just showed you. Probably as a consequence of this confusing setup on backpack.tf, price suggesters don't really want to make price suggestions on unusual weapons, and their prices are all over the place. For instance, battle scarred should always be cheaper than well worn, which should be cheaper than field tested, and so on and so forth. However, I've seen a number of times where a field-tested version was actually more expensive than a minimal wear version of the exact same skin. In addition, only about half the skins are actually priced, putting their value somewhat up in the air. I will talk more about unpriced unusuals later in the episode. Anyway, when you put all of this together, unusual weapons are perceived as quite risky. And I can't really blame people for giving them this reputation. They're commonly unpriced, and when they do have a price, it is really hard to know whether that is even close to what it should be, and that's not even accounting for the horrible excuse for a weapon price list that Backpack.tf currently has. Thus, almost 99% of the time, I would rather have an unusual taunt or hat rather than an unusual weapon, simply because there is far more certainty in their pricing, even if they are overpriced. But again, I definitely do think it is worth pointing out that this doesn't mean that you should never trade for unusual weapons. Just like taunts, people are often willing to give you some insane deals. While this is normally bad advice, with unusual weapons, the stupid catchphrase buy low, sell high is really what you need to make profit. Since prices are quite a bit more arbitrary, just buy at a low price from someone who thinks that it is cancer, and just sell it to someone else for even a little bit more. I'd recommend never to trade a hat or taunt for an unusual weapon in a 1-for-1 trade of equal value, but it really isn't uncommon to get a pretty insane overpay offer with an unusual weapon, and in that case I really see no reason not to pounce on the offer. With unpriced weapons, I would also point out that buying any non-SMG unusual weapon for around 20 to 30 keys in unusuals is a pretty good deal since you can easily get way more if you are persistent. On the other hand, I would almost never buy a non-priced unusual weapon for 70 or more keys, as there is little room for profit there. Also, I would recommend targeting factory new or strange weapons, as these types of unusuals can get some pretty insane offers from collectors or just people who plan on trading for these weapons to keep. Finally, let's talk about unpriced unusuals. Now, if you've traded unusuals for even a little bit of time, you've probably had one of these offered to you and you may have panicked. After all, how can you buy an unusual that doesn't have a price? Well, to put any fears aside, unpriced unusuals should have prices and are not worthless at all. Their sales and subsequently price have simply not been recorded yet in an official price suggestion. Now, you might be wondering, well, how do you know how to value an unpriced unusual? Well, to do exactly this, you need to consider 3 things. Number 1, any active sellers. Number 2, any open or closed price suggestions on the unusual. And number 3, its relative tier compared to other similar effects. First, you should take a look at the sellers. To do this, hit stats on the unusual in question to view the sellers on Backpack.tf. Then hit Outpost on the unusual to check for sellers on Outpost. Now, some people might tell you to look at the sellers to give you the official price of an item, but I would tend to disagree with them. After all, sellers can list an unusual for whatever price they want, even if it is way too high. However, sellers can still be quite useful because they can help you determine the maximum an unusual could be worth. For example, if someone is selling an unpriced hat at say 30 keys, it's pretty safe to say that you couldn't get 35 for it. Thus, you should see if there are any sellers, and if there are, note their selling points as the maximum the unusual could be worth. Next, you should take a look at past price suggestions. This can be viewed from the stats page of unusual as well. A lot of the time there isn't anything here, but if there is anything, it can give you a ton of information about the unusual in question. Remember, price suggestions work by documenting past sales of unusuals, so you should go ahead and take a look at the sales in each suggestion and note their value. If a price suggestion is active, as long as it hasn't been open for a week or more on end, there's a high chance that the unusual will be priced at that value. However, if you encounter a closed suggestion or an open suggestion that has been up for a lot of weeks, you should be more suspicious. The fact that the price suggestion hasn't been accepted yet should tell you that something was wrong with how the suggestion was made. Sometimes this could be the inaccurate documentation of sales, but it is more commonly that sales are currently too spread out to give an accurate value. For example, with a sale at 30 keys and a sale at 60 keys, it isn't always easy to rule out which one is the outlier. You should still note these sales as potential values, but be aware that they may not be replicatable. Last, you should compare the unusual to other effects on the unusual price list. This is definitely the hardest to explain way to value an unpriced unusual, but it is very important, so I'm going to try my best to explain this in a pretty clear way. First, you should hit the unusual button on the unusual, and it will bring up a page with all the effects of the given unusual. While there is no perfect way to do this, a good tool that I use to help value an unusual this way is to use a few representative effects to break down the effect list into tier ranges. Let's assume that you're trying to value a hat. So let's use Purple Energy, Disco Beatdown, and Nuts and Bolts respectively, since almost 90% of the time, Purple Energy will be more expensive than Disco, which is more expensive than Nuts and Bolts. Now, all you will need to do is to place your effect in between two of these effects, and match it to a reasonable amount of keys. From what I've noticed, almost any second or third gen effect is located in values somewhere between Nuts and Bolts and Disco Beatdown. This low tier range also includes first gen effects like the confettis, TF logo, peace sign, flies, and often searing and vivid plasmas. You can also find Overclocked, Memory Leak, Starstorm Insomnia, Starstorm Slumber, and Neutron Star in here as well. From Disco Beatdown to Purple Energy, this mid-range tier gets a little more muddled in that the prices are a little bit less defined. For the most part though, you can find effects such as Hearts, as well as Ghosts, Electrostatic, Power Surge, Time Warp, Green Black Hole, Phosphorus Sulphurus, Mallard, and Tesla Coil, as well as less good Halloween effects such as Cauldron Bubbles, Eerie Orbiting Fire, Ghastly Ghost Jr., Haunted Phantasm Jr., and Flaming Lantern. Above Purple Energy is where the really nice effects lie. You will find effects such as Morning Glory, Death at Dusk, Frostbite, Roboactive, Antifreeze, and pretty much any Halloween effect that I haven't named yet. What I also think is really cool about this approach is that it can allow you to identify unusuals that are overpriced. For example, if you see that green confetti is more expensive than purple energy, you can see pretty clearly that the green confetti is inflated. Anyway, knowing this, let's assume that you have an unpriced Death at Dusk Grenader soft cap. It would be in the above purple energy range, and looking at the prices of other high tier effects, you can notice that they are quite all over the place, ranging from 40 to 130 keys. Keeping in mind that the most expensive Halloween effects are definitely overpriced, I would take an average and value the hat at a conservative 65 keys. For taunts, this technique is a little bit more difficult, simply because a lot of the prices are up in the air as taunts are getting repriced. However, I think that effects like Mega Strike and 72 are pinpoint mid-range effects, and you can use them to split the effects into two tier ranges. Most commonly, effects like Ghastly Ghost, Haunted Phantasm, Holy Grail, Screaming Tiger, Showstopper, and Fountain of Delight can be found as being more expensive than these, while effects such as Infernal Smoke, Infernal Flames, Spectral Swirl, Hellish Inferno, Silver Cyclone, Midnight Whirlwind, and Skill-Gotten Gains are commonly found as being less than these. So let's assume that you have a Silver Cyclone Square Dance, and you want to find a reasonable price to value it at. Thus, you should see that effects like 72 and Mega Strike are right in the middle, and while there is a massive price difference between 107 and 62, you should figure that Silver Cyclone's price would need to be less than both of these. Seeing the partner effect Midnight Whirlwind at 41 keys, I think it would be pretty safe to value the taunt at around 40 keys. Unfortunately, this method is very difficult for unusual weapons. Yes, you can use the method I showed before to find the prices of different unusual weapons, but there are often so many inaccuracies and holes in the pricing that this really isn't feasible. Thus, I would definitely recommend viewing as many buyouts and suggestions as you can, including weapons that are close to but not exactly the same as yours. This way, you will have more price points for the first two methods of determining value, which should help you get a little bit of a closer value as to what to price the weapon at. Now, if you just unboxed a brand new Unusual out of a new update, you might be wondering how any of this would apply to you. After all, it is unlikely that there are any sales on the Unusual yet, and buyouts are highly inaccurate, especially if you're dealing with an Unusual with no priced effects. However, while this is definitely the hardest situation to find a definitive price, there are still ways you can get a rough value of your Unusual. If you have a new item with an old effect, you should look at other Unusuals of the same type, class, tier, and wear if it has these, and see how much that effect is on average. Honestly, these numbers should be pretty close to what you can get for it, so I would say that is pretty accurate. If you get an old hat with a brand new effect, you're going to need to figure out how rare the new effect is. If the effect is distributed like old Halloween effects, where there are a ton of different effects that can drop on any unusual item, chances are your unbox is quite rare and very expensive. If the effect can be unboxed only out of one new case like in the Invasion update, chances are the price is much lower. This is even more the case if you unbox an Unusual from a 2x unbox rate event. One general tip I would have here is to always favor a high price on new Unusuals. If you think your item could be worth maybe 50 to 100 keys, just go ahead and value it at 100. People love to trade into the hype, and there's really no harm in setting a stupidly high buyout as long as you are willing to go down and accept a more sensible offer if it just isn't selling. Alright, so now that we've gotten all of that pricing out of the way, you should be able to find a rough value for pretty much any type of unpriced Unusual. Now, here's my general advice for unpriced items. From my experience, an Unusual being unpriced isn't always an explicitly good or bad attribute to an item's tier. Usually when you have a super nice Unusual that is unpriced, most people couldn't care less. However, if you have a really poor item, maybe like a Searing Plasma Heavy Hat, it certainly makes it harder to sell because people would want to not only trade for a kind of bad item, but also an item that has a questionable price. As you can imagine, because of this, and just like unusual weapons, unpriced unusuals get the reputation of having inherent risk because you ultimately cannot just fall back on a price suggestion as evidence of their value. While I did just say that these unusuals have risk, I found that with unpriced unusuals, you really don't even need to risk that much to get some of the best profits in the entirety of unusual trading. You see, there are a lot of people who far overvalue their unpriced unusuals, thinking that they can get way more than they actually will. However, there are also a lot of people that panic when they get something without a price and are willing to give you some insane deals on these items. I mean, if you negotiate, I found that you can easily buy an unpriced unusual with other unusuals that are far less in value than the price I'd value the unpriced hat at, and you can easily just resell this unpriced unusual for a higher price. While this is definitely more of an expert tip, one thing I would note here is that you should avoid buying unpriced unusuals with pure keys unless you can get at least like a 40% off discount off the price you think it should be valued at. This is because when you trade for an unpriced hat, you're going to be giving suggestors proof for a suggestion, and pure sales are often just as valid as unusual ones. Thus, it is totally a possibility to buy an unpriced unusual as a quick sell with pure keys, and then get massively screwed over when the item gets priced at whatever amount you bought it for. Thus, you want to buy at a huge discount so that your pure sale can clearly be considered a low outlier. Anyway, that is just going to do it for the video. I know this has been super long, so I'm going to keep this outro super short. If you have any questions or need help, be sure to leave a comment in the comment section below, and until next time guys, thanks for watching.